I'm really happy to be here tonight with Donna Honarpisheh and the artist whose work is included in Portals. My name is Blair Murphy. I'm the Senior Curator and Director of Exhibitions at Museum of Contemporary Art Arlington in Arlington, Virginia. I know a few people may be joining us from outside the DC area. So if you haven't visited the museum, we are a small non-collecting contemporary art museum just outside of DC. We have an education program, an exhibitions program, and an artist residency. So with our exhibitions program, we exhibit contemporary art by artists working in the area, in the region, across the country, and from around the world, and work pretty frequently with guest curators, which is always a really great way to expand our network and bring in work by artists that our audience may not have been familiar with in the past. So I'm really happy to be here tonight with these artists and with Donna. I'm going to do a quick introduction of Donna and then hand it over to her so she can have a conversation with the artists. We will have a Q&A at the end of their conversation. So if you think of questions as the talk is ongoing, please share those in the Q&A feature and we'll get to a few of those at the end. So thank you so much. And thanks again to Donna. Donna Honarpisheh is Associate Curator of Night Art and Research at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Miami, where she curates global exhibitions in modern and contemporary art. She is the writer and host of ICA Miami's award-winning podcast, Tomorrow is the Problem, which covers pressing issues in art and culture. In addition to her curatorial work, Honarpisheh is a scholar of comparative literature and critical theory and has taught undergraduate courses in global modernisms, post-colonial studies, and aesthetics at Fordham University, Sarah Lawrence College, UC Berkeley, and Georgetown University. Thanks so much for being here tonight, Donna.
Thank you so much, Blair, and thank you to everyone for being here. I'm just gonna introduce our artists who I've had the pleasure of working with over the course of curating this show, and I'm just so grateful to them for how the show came together, and I'm excited to talk about their work tonight. So I'll just get started so we can get into our conversation. I'm going to first introduce Aryana Minai, who is an Iranian American artist based in Los Angeles. Her work explores the intersection of memory, place, and transformation in her large-scale paper pulp works. Her practice examines architecture, migration, labor, and the body, often referencing the walled gardens of Iran and the pickup truck beds of Los Angeles day laborers. Through a process of pulping and reconstituting paper, Minai mirrors the act of remembering, embedding traces of her labor alongside imprints of bricks, floral motifs, vintage Iranian woodblocks, and stencils evoking her childhood bedroom in post-revolutionary Iran. These works question the permanence of architecture, the role of nostalgia in shaping spaces, and the resilience of memory in the face of erasure. She received her bachelor's from Art Center College of Design in 2016 and an MFA from Yale School of Art in 2020. Selected solo exhibitions include Tara Downs and James Fuentes in New York, Nazarian Curcio in Los Angeles, and group exhibitions in Murmur's Gallery and Craft Contemporary Museum in Los Angeles and the Benton Museum of Art in Claremont, California. Shyama Golden is an LA-based Sri Lankan American artist who uses world building and narrative to reveal the metaphysical dimensions within the mundane. Her work is drawn to the potential of figurative art to explore the constructed nature of identity and social performance. She has exhibited at the Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art Sri Lanka, Jeffrey Deitch Gallery in New York and Los Angeles, and Mickey Mang in San Francisco. Her work is held in international public and private collections, including the permanent collections of the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, Dangja Art Space in Beijing, and the Craig Robbins Collection in Miami. And last but not least, Aiza Ahmed is born in Lahore, Pakistan, and lives and works in New York. She is an interdisciplinary artist whose practice encompasses painting, drawing, sculpture, installation, and video to contend with notions of borders, migrations, public histories, and private archives within diasporic identities originating from the Indian subcontinent. She earned her BFA from Cornell University and received her MFA in painting from the Rhode Island School of Design in 2024. Her work has been exhibited internationally, including a recent solo booth at Spring Break Art Show in New York and a two-person show at 12 Gates Arts in Philadelphia. She has exhibited in group exhibitions including the RISD Museum, the Flag Art Foundation, Herbert F. Johnson Museum of Art, Ithaca, um, the Art Gallery in Karachi, Pakistan, among others. In 2024, she was selected for residencies with the William Kentridge and Center for the Less Good at Brown Arts Institute and the Macedonia Institute. She is currently artist in residence at Silver Art Projects in New York City. So I'm really happy to be gathered here to talk about the idea of portals and how that connects to all of your work. I'll give a little overview of how I was thinking about the concept and why I was drawn to your work. So, for me, a portal is really a liminal space. It's an intermediary space. It's a channel between worlds. It captures this idea of the not yet, the possible, the hidden. And I think so much of your work touches on these things, things that are both invisible, possible, not yet born, reimagining multiple worlds. And I think what's especially crucial to point out is that you all are building from non-Western traditions to think about what the portal means to you. And that was especially important when curating this exhibition, is really to foreground these non-Western epistemologies and ways of knowing that emerge from different places and also come into our understanding of dreams and nightmares and theater and architecture. So I'd love it if we could just talk as an opening about what the idea of a portal means in each of your work, and if we could just start a conversation around that. Maybe we can start with Ariana.
I can totally go first. I mean, I was joking earlier about how everything is a portal and sort of like the more I think about it, the more I really do feel like, you know, our body is actually even a portal, like, our DNA is sort of like a portal into our ancestors and, traditions and culture and even just like the way that we move and act today, I think comes from all of that influence. But for me, I think I started thinking about the idea of a portal when I was when I was becoming more interested in the idea of dreaming and sleeping. And there was like a point in my life where I felt like dreaming or sleeping was a lot better than just being awake. And I think it made me think about, how do I grasp this like very like sort of, I don't know, like sad thought. And then I had to sort of change that sad thought into this sort of more of a, I don't know, sort of felt a little bit better to think of it as, well, why, how am I dreaming, or how do I become to dream? I'm sort of being able to rest in this like safe space that I've curated around me that's allowing me to dream. And then these dreams are actually like world building. It's sort of like an unconscious imaginary place. And then I was very influenced by this artist, Alejandro Cartagena, who had these sort of like aerial views of truck beds here in LA over a bridge that he photographed. And it was day laborers sleeping, sort of, perfectly fitting in this like truck bed. And then I started to think more about like the Iranian day beds, the tasks that we had in, in outdoor spaces where we sleep and rest after a day of labor. And so, yeah, I don't know, a lot of the pieces actually took shape of this truck bed or this day bed. And I started to think about, making spaces that are portals, like making these like actually built up portals. So some of them are doors, gates, and really like entrances to these portals for myself. But then I think in another way where I was like, everything is a portal, I started thinking about the tools I was using and these, old wood blocks that were carried or, given to me by friends that were sending them to me from Iran and, not sending them directly from Iran because you can't really like ship things. So it was going from like a friend to an aunt to like a sister to like another, like someone's niece. And, it was getting carried all of this way to me to like make these pieces. And so when I finally received these objects, I'm like, this is a portal. Like this has like so much memory and it's gone through different hands and it has its own journey. And now I'm adding this into this like world building. But yeah, I think that I just think of these portals as like not really places. I think it's a tool. I think the portal that I'm creating with the works are really a tool to sort of understand my own maybe influences of like memory, but also, memory is it's not a fact. It's sort of like maybe a fact with an intuitive idea of what you think that memory was. So it just sort of becomes this like imaginary space. And so who's to say I can't really make that imaginary space for myself as well?
Wonderful. Does Shama want to go next?
Yeah, sure. So for me, the portal has come into play a lot in my recent work. A lot of my work is narrative, and I do start by thinking in terms of story. And one of the recent series I worked on kind of acts almost like a LA-based Alice in Wonderland kind of story where I'm this character that falls through a gopher hole, which are just like really abundant here, and something that most people would walk by and, never notice. But once you notice them, you start seeing them everywhere. And I wanted to think about that as a potential portal and where that would lead to. And like I wanted it to go into the subconscious, so that would be a way to enter a new world and start telling a story there. And I think for me, a lot of times the portal could be just to another part of the self that may not have been available to you before. Kind of like when you have a dream and you go into this room that you've never seen before, you have like more space in your home. I wanted to use that framework to start telling the stories in the paintings.
That's great. Aiza?
So I've been thinking about the idea of portals in many different ways. I want to say starting off like as a geographical border. Um, a lot of the work that's on display is part of my ongoing exploration of the Vaga Atari Pakistan-India border ceremony that takes place every day and has been since 1959. So, wanting to think about that physical line, that border that was drawn by the British, back in 1947, I think, takes you back in terms of geography, historical context. And then someone like myself who has been born in Pakistan, but then moved around from London, Dubai, the US, for schooling, it's just a lot of kind of thinking about these different places and how they make you a whole, right? Kind of belonging to multiple places at once and what that looks like. Also thinking about it in terms of temporality. So by referencing the 1947, partition between India and Pakistan, and its ongoing legacies into the present day, but also other partitions like 1971, when Pakistan was then divided between East and West. East being present day Bangladesh and West being present day Pakistan, which is where I'm originally from. And then the kind of ancestry that comes with that. I have my paternal roots in Bangladesh, maternal in Pakistan. And so there's just so much to uncover and excavate through oral interviews, through research, through readings and films. And so kind of time is something that I'm thinking about as a portal. Um, I think more relevant to the show also is the idea of theater and staging and performance. I love, Shama, when you talk about social performance like that. I think, we're all kind of masking identities. And so I'm super excited about these border guards who are, daily between India and Pakistan, who have this kind of performance of nationalism, militarism, a hyper-masculine space, thinking about architecture, and Ariana, where you were talking about kind of these gates and doors, there are physical gates, right? And this little no man's land in between where you can see the other side and thousands of people cheering as spectators. but you can't physically cross that boundary. Um, so I think theater, and then lastly I'm thinking about the psychological portal. So really wanting to delve into the psyche of men, and what that means. And you'll see that a lot of the work has been very kind of an exploration of men, and they're doing these really absurd gestures and postures, and that's kind of taking from this performance or the military march, that happens every day. I've been looking at it as a performance, and thinking about it as a spectacle, as a stage, and what that means. Wanting to kind of break down their uniforms and then the shoes and the headgear. It's like these props and costumes. So really kind of operating in that space of theater, borders, being a fictional space, and playing with that illusion, breaking it in all these different mediums, which we can delve into later.
Mhm. I'm just going to stop sharing for a little while so I can see you, but I think that you all have this highly grounded practice where you each are working from what you're seeing from a place, from Aiza, like from a performance that is actually staged, historically, but also every day. Ariana, from the materials that you're working with, the act of labor, Shama, from the, things that you're seeing in Los Angeles, from your own feelings and experiences in your subconscious. And then at the same time, there's this relationship to time where a portal isn't something that is linear or straightforward or progressive, but enables a kind of time traveling, and not necessarily always to the past or to the future, but it carries its own time. And I'm just wondering if you could speak a little bit to that, and you all already have a bit, but this simultaneous groundedness, and the possibilities in time of revisiting another time, or of accessing a time that isn't necessarily part of our waking realities.
I think when Isa was talking about performance, I throughout the show I've been trying to think about like where that is in my work, and I realize it's maybe not in the work, but it's like in the studio process. And there's a lot of labor that I do in the studio that doesn't really is not really presented when it's like in a room or in a show. And a lot of like these pieces behind me that are sort of like the bigger doorway pieces take around 10 to 12 hours to make. And it's, you have to sort of make it in one go because it's paper, and the way that the dye works and the way that the bricks are impressed, like all of that has sort of like a system that want I want the work to sort of be done, and then I let it maybe like go into its own portal and like, exist without me manipulating it after that. But I was thinking about the like state of mind that I'm in when I do work on like the 12-hour sessions. And it sort of does put me in this maybe trance that does feel a little bit more like a port, like I am entering maybe a portal, and there's a lot of like reckoning that comes in that. It's a lot of like, confronting like grief and trauma, and sort of, your body is sort of being pushed to this point of exhaustion where you're kind of just free to think about anything. And maybe for me, like that is in a very like literal sense what the time does, and what, where my body enters when my body enters that space in the studio. Um, but yeah, I don't know. I've done a lot of like very odd things after a studio session, after like 12 hours, where I'll come back the next day and I'm like, who did that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's something about memory that feels like you can, and memory and our own projections of the future that can feel like a portal. And, our experience of reality exists entirely in the mind. So we do time travel all the time. And so I feel like all like past, present, future, like it does live together, in a way. And especially now with how online we are, I feel like we're also constantly like our own selves, like our own past selves are constantly available for people to see online, whether they're looking at your, social media or whatever it may be. So in that way, I do feel like this kind of non-linear time feels like a part of reality that we can show in art in a way that maybe feels more honest than what most people think at face value,
Absolutely.
thinking linearly.
Yeah.
I love the idea of, as you say, time travel and our past selves. And I feel like in my practice, I feel like a detective. Like I'm constantly kind of connecting. It's connecting the dots, but I say connecting the lines because my work is so line driven. Um, where I think about kind of, during undergrad, I was making kind of line-based work inspired by someone like Alice Neal, who has that kind of distinct ultramarine blue in her paintings. And then I kind of think about what I'm doing now, and it's like these little eureka moments and you just keep digging in and delving further into what you're doing. Um, and these traces that start to appear, why one's using certain colors, that they keep coming back and you start to notice those patterns, right? Um, yeah, I had multiple thoughts, but I'll leave
Yeah.
it at
Well, I think in your context, I think about, the line that you draw as something that's malleable and flexible in contradistinction to the border, which is very rigid and fixed. And so there's a way that by paralleling those two things, then you're able to approach a historical moment or a violent past in a new and imaginative way, and to imagine an alternative future. Um, yeah, wondering if you have.
Yeah, no, no, absolutely. And I think the line, and maybe we can kind of segue into process a bit more, but
Yeah.
I would say my practice is really rooted in drawing, right? In the line. And it started off as blind contour. So thinking about what it means to really engage in looking at a subject and kind of letting my hand just unfurl kind of continuously and these distortions that start to happen and kind of then peeking through the periphery. And I think that process has really helped me and kind of amplified in my sculptures and my paintings and kind of what that means. Um, what does that loss look like? Thinking about ancestors and kind of, how they had to surrender and kind of just leave home to make a new home and what that means. So I think there's a lot in that line, and it's wiry, it's in motion, it's not static, and I kind of allow myself. So kind of Ariana, when you were talking about you kind of feel like you're in a trance or you're kind of performing almost like this ritual. I sometimes just put on really loud music and just allow myself to dance, and that energy through the music then just gets conveyed through my hand, and it's leaving that raw drawing. Like I don't like to go and edit and kind of clean up whatever I've made. It feels like a vessel. I think that's the word that I really think about with a lot of our works. Yeah, I'm excited to hear if you resonate with that, both Ariana and Shama.
Well, just back and going into process too, I think that there's so much in Shama and Ariana's work also that is tied to, for Shama, it's like the intimate inner world that we don't typically have access to. And then there's all these things that are also still invisible, even beyond what we do see. With Ariana, there's such a, you know, embodied presence. I think when you see the works, you can't fully apprehend how much of your physical body has gone into them. And I think that's also testament to the materials that you're working with, and this reference to architectural objects, and how much of, the physical embodied experience is perhaps repressed from what we see in the final product. So I'm wondering if you could speak, both of you, to your process and what goes behind what we see.
Yeah, I can start. I think my process does start with this kind of backstory. So I like to have this whole lore that nobody will ever know. But in the way that, you know, I guess like screenwriting would work or something else. Like a good character needs to have a huge backstory, even if no one will ever hear about it. So I enjoy that part. And I like to think about this whole, larger world. And then I create these vignettes to slowly reveal that world to the audience. And I'm painting, but I start with kind of like storyboards actually, with these like thumbnail sketches of the images in series so I can think about how that will be received in that particular order when it's in an exhibition.
And your work is so referential in terms of like you're also referencing other images that you're creating in many of your paintings. So there is this sense that there is a broader story being told.
Exactly. Great. I'm glad that comes through.
Yeah, I love that both of you have like very, I think like visually they're all very much like the same. Like I don't know what's gonna happen next when I'm moving through the room, but there's like such a like Aiza, yours is like very intuitive with like moving with like your arm, and then Shama is like there is like this narrative background that sort of like structures the work. And I think for me, maybe I'm somewhere in between where like I actually don't know where the work's going. When I started, I have very like plain sketches or almost like diagrams, like a Brancusi diagram sort of thing, where I'm like, there's arrows and numbers. But I think the tools are like the structures or the basis of like, what comes with the narrative of what the work will be, whether it's like a specific wood block or if it's if I have like 20 bricks or something by my side that day. And then also just the labor of like pulping and turning. I use I recycle old like cotton mat boards, and I sort of like I have to put those in water, soak them, and then I put them in a blender, and then I turn them into pulp, and then it goes back into the blender, and it's like, I spin the dye in it with it, so I don't dye them, or there's no like dyeing process. It's sort of very intuitive of like kitchen type thing. And then once I'm doing that process, immediately the idea starts brewing in my mind, and I know exactly what I want to do. And then that never ends up actually happening. And by the end of it, it's very different. But I think I've come to this process because I used to make paintings that were very geometrical and stenciled and very much, I planned out. And I was referencing architecture in Iran that had these sort of like geometric shapes and patterns, but then I think I slowly realized that even those architectures, like even those buildings are changing. Like they're shedding, you know, they're getting restored or just like there's like they're constantly threatened for like destruction. And I don't know, I felt like there was like a lot of energy actually in the buildings and in the architecture that wasn't really coming out in these like very refined and like perfect paintings. And so paper felt to me very much like embodied of that nature. And also the way that it's so easily just takes my impression and really holds me. And yeah, I feel like we sort of became like soulmates when we met. So yeah, that's sort of my process and material choice, I guess.
Yeah, when you talk about the impression, it recalls for me the ghostly, and I was just thinking across all of your work, and I don't think this is readily obvious, but there is something ghostly in each of your practices. I think Isa, in your works, it's the moments where the line is exceeded and figures are blurred, and there is, something kind of cryptic about that. Shama, I think that the settings that you create are super uncanny, and there's just a strangeness that emanates from them. Um, and Ariana, I feel like there is this sense of, just multiple layers of time and this kind of residues and traces, and like you're saying, these impressions of your hand, but also of moments lost that I think is part of the material practice of your work. And then at the same time, I think that each of your practices is imagining something and is super generative and is very creative. So there's this tension between the ghostly, the ruin, a sense of decay, and also, a creative capacity or a possibility of imagining another world. So I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about that. Maybe we can start with Shama and you can talk a little bit about the uncanny and the strange aspects of your work because there's a lot of settings that seem familiar. There's self-portrait involved. Um, and then maybe you could tell us a little bit about some of these figures that we're seeing, where they come from, and what you're pulling from there.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm using a lot of imagery that comes from Sri Lankan folklore, and I've always like grown up having these masks in our home. um, kind of only vaguely knowing what they were for. I knew they were for protection and like talismans. But then I got more interested, over the past 5 years of reading more deeply into the histories of the use of these masks and how they were used in rituals. And I thought that there was like an exorcism ritual that uses one type of mask, and they're called yakas. I mean, Thowil is the ritual, but the yakas are these spirits, and I mean they could be seen as demons, but they're definitely different from the Western conception of a demon, in that you can ask them for protection. They're not just purely evil, and they have many different personalities. They're not just one monolith. So I found those really interesting, because they all have these like very human characteristics, and they represent these different human characteristics. So I started using those masks as the visual language in my own work to think about my own self-image. And actually, like in this image here, this is this car crash that happens in the subconscious world after I fall through the gopher hole. And it's a collision with this alter ego who I call Maya. And and then her belly opens up a portal, this red glowing world. And the painting on the right kind of shows this descent into that portal where you see my head on the top as people know me in this world, in this dimension. And then it kind of dissolves down into this mask of my self-perceived identity, which then goes like further and further, like lower resolution into these forms that actually are based on the steps of the wood mask carving. Like if you go to a workshop where they're making masks, you'll see like it starts with the stump, and then you get like a rough carved shape, and then it'll be, sanded further and then painted. And those are the steps I wanted to show of like descending down into this tree stump, because in this narrative, then I'm reborn out of a tree in the LA River. But I also thought this was really interesting, and I think Ariana mentioned this earlier, but like this idea of this portal to ancestors, and thinking so far back in terms of ancestors to go back to like the earliest life, and that we are related even to trees, And I wanted to think on this like really large time scale, um, which is kind of, almost it is like a tree time scale because time moves so much faster for trees because they have this like much longer history than humans. And so that's where I was kind of going with this to try to connect all these different life forms, and thinking about the red curtain as something like that's the kind of what separates the conscious from the subconscious in a way, like the things that are within our own mind that we don't know, which are probably way more than the things that we actually know, like the wisdom that we have that we can't access with our conscious minds.
Absolutely. And I think your work also, it's so LA in the sense that you have these screens and you have like reference to cinema and the stage here. So the red curtain is something that is stage, it also, I mean, it veils, but it also discloses when it's opened. So that also, we painted a wall red for Aiza's installation, and was thinking also about the portal as something that, you know, discloses. It also shields and covers, but also theater or staging as this channel into revisiting or relating to time in a different way. So I'm wondering, Isa, if you could talk a little bit about what the red curtain means for you, because it also comes up a lot in your work. We have
Yeah.
red wall here, but also here we go.
Yeah. No, I mean I loved hearing Shyama talk about that, and I didn't know that that was kind of the next in sequence, kind of with that pairing of those two paintings. That was really exciting to see. And then thinking back to Alice in Wonderland, like that analogy, because I also do love the whimsical, the surreal, and I think that kind of comes out with the almost like lyrical movement of the way I paint or I draw, almost like script-like or calligraphic, although that's kind of going into a different tangent. But I think about the kind of the behind the scenes, in all these different bodies of work, there's kind of we're all performing in different contexts. And I just find that so fascinating that how one code switches, thinking about diaspora and coming from different places and how you start to connect with different communities and how that works. Um, but the language of costuming and props and if we go to maybe the wood cutouts, thinking about how, that they're hollow, I kind of carve them with my power tools, this kind of very male dominated materials such as wood, but this role reversal that starts to happen, and kind of reclaiming that kind of gendered tradition in a way. But then they don't have backs, so you can, thinking about how you can kind of walk around in other installations, I've shown you can see the backs of these cutouts. So thinking about questions of accessibility and getting kind of a full view. But I think really going back to the question of ghosts and traces and imprints, I think about the use of muslin. And that's a material that I'm really excited about right now and have shown also in our show. But it was, it's this fabric that was once kind of the prized possession, kind of originating in the Indian subcontinent, specifically present day Bangladesh, and how the Mughal rulers used to wear this fabric. It was so special. And then, through colonialism, through trade, that was violently decimated. But using this material and going back to what you said, Donna, about the line kind of unfurling or the spillages, like it's not a fixed line. And we can see that kind of porousness that happens with this fabric, that I get really excited about. So I think destabilizing what that line, what that border is, becomes really exciting. And muslin becomes a portal into histories, women's labor, traditions. And yeah, I think there's a lot in that, without it being so overtly kind of in your face.
Mhm. Thank you. Yeah, Ariana, if you want to, I mean, maybe we can talk a little bit about this piece, Ruined, since it most, clearly indexes this
The
idea.
red clay. I love what both of you said about the color red. It's been like I don't know, it's been a minute since I've like really thought about what, a pure, like just like a color is straightforwardly means, and like I think that wall that you painted that's sort of like like kind of the glowing onto like my piece and just like the room was like so thoughtful. And also Shama, what you were saying about the piece on the side that was sort of like a portal into the other piece, that was, I also didn't know, and that was amazing to hear. I mean, I think like the color red and like thinking about like red earth is kind of directly tied to creation myths, which is like, humans made from clay and from earth, like earth, from clay, from earth, and like the blood colored dust. And it's sort of the color of life and of birth and flesh and soil, and but it's also like the color of erosion. And there's this like duality of like generative ground and like, like a exhausted terrain maybe. But I I think it's interesting. I've with the clay bricks, actually, I used to use this pigmented rock from Hormuz Island in Iran, and it was given to me by a friend. And I was using it and I was like drawing with it and sort of like crushing it, turning it into pigment. And I think at some point, like I realized that the material was like so special and rare that I actually didn't want to use it anymore. And I ended up just like putting it in the work as like a preserved material. And because I didn't have access to it, and it was sort of like a resource that was inaccessible to me at the time. And so I took this like last chunk of it and I built a shelf within one of my pieces, and I sort of just like sat it on there like an altar. And like I don't know, the red clays and the bricks in the show are actually not handmade. They're sort of I have to sort of just go for this like mass-produced material, which is like what you do when things aren't available to you, I guess. Like, the similarly in talking about the muslin, I think, it this like really beautiful, like, so deeply rooted like object, like a handmade clay brick, which is where my, initial interest in architecture was rooted, with my dad being like, so many hands went into making this building because of these bricks. And, the story of Gilgamesh is always really interesting to me because the king of Uruk sort of like carved this red brick and put it back and built a city, and then built immortality in return for that because he would always exist in this brick. So all of that sort of, I thought about all of that, and also my inaccessibility to like make this like, super rich red clay handmade brick. And instead I just made handmade paper pulp bricks. And so I guess in a way it was sort of doing that same thing for me. And I don't know, there was this duality of setting them on top of each other and sort of just only thinking about this mass-produced red brick as a pedestal, to creating this sort of like handmade paper brick that were the papers were passed to me by multiple friends and family, and even like old like paper in the garage of my parents' house. And I had to create my own sort of history within it. And I don't know, it ended up being this echoed like in-betweenness of like belonging and displacement, and like what do you do when you are displaced. And I think people who are in diaspora and migrate, we're very much like gatherers of materials, and we kind of hoard in a weird way, where there's like a limitation to the materials that we want to use that are available to us, and we just kind of go around and gathering something and then building something new. And I think that's where these brick pieces came from. And then the flowers and the plants inside them are molded from fragments, like gate metal fragments that I find in LA around the studio, walking around. And they're, another way to just preserve and think about this bed now as like a garden bed or a bed to lay on, and to think about what can grow from that. And, it's sort of like this site of like regeneration.
I wanted to add, because our works are kind of in conversation, this idea of care and material and weightedness and groundedness. It's so interesting to see kind of my wood, that's really heavy material, kind of juxtaposed with like the fragility of these paper pulp bricks, and I didn't know that initially, until kind of hearing you talk more about that was so exciting. Again, this idea of masking also kind of, you want it to perform like this very sacred brick, but it's, it's your own version of that in a way.
Totally.
And then I was also thinking about kind of my soldiers almost kind of choreographing or in a procession into your darwaze, like into your gates, like around the room. And that image has really stuck with me, and I'm excited to kind of build off of that in the next body of work. Um, yeah, I was excited about that.
Great. Well, we have some questions here from the audience. This is Blair. I'm just going to hop in and share those with you guys. So we have a question from Cheryl. She asks, were you familiar with one another's work before the call tonight? It also makes me think about it. Were you familiar with before the exhibition? And if so, did you feel any similarities or connections?
I think I had been following I think I was following both of you, if not at least one of you on Instagram. But you don't really think about the way that your work would feel next to each other until really it is. And once we were in the room, like when I was installing, I felt really like, whoa, there's so many things that we can sort of like connect. And even if they're not, my work has a lot of metaphors, and then there's like Shama's work has a lot of like very direct like references, and then Aiza has this like, thing that happened even in the installation of her work and like the performance of installing, like those pieces are bigger than her. Like there was so much that I related to where I was like, oh, like my pieces feel really giant to me when I'm working, and there's like this idea of like labor, and I don't know, there's a lot that I think came to light, and I think Donna was the one that just saw it actually before all of us.
100%.
I think materially, I mean, you're each working in varied materials, and um, there's so many ways that one could divide your practices, in terms of thinking about like what's figurative and what's non-figurative. But I think that each of you have the ability to transport the viewer, and I think that's what I held on to when thinking about the exhibition.
Yeah, I really love that the similarities they're not really like surface level similarities. They're much deeper thematic threads that I don't know that I would have necessarily like noticed that, you know, right away. I mean, that's why we need curators like
Curator.
Donna.
Yeah.
But together they really do all add to each other and speak together. I mean, speak to each other. I love that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think being in conversation kind of that we've been having leading up to this talk has been really exciting. Just like noticing so many subtleties that maybe otherwise wouldn't, right? It's Ariane, as you said, it's so hard to kind of start to draw parallels more physically until you're really in the space. Um, but yeah. So thank you, Donna.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I was going to jump in with with one more question. Ariana, early on when you were talking about your work, I think in response to the first question, you mentioned world building, and that term really resonates so much with all three of your work. And I was sort of curious, as artists, you all seem really, artists often work in series. They'll create a new body of work that's meant to be a sort of cohesive body of work for a show, but it feels like in a way all three of you sort of go beyond that. Like you really are working in this way where you've created this universe and are um, sort of committed to that as a world building strategy that sort of transcends any one exhibition. And I was curious about if you think about your work in that way, or if that's something that's kind of grown organically through your practice.
I feel like artists become artists because they're like resisting a current reality or something. Like we see something and we're visualizing something that could replace it. Maybe, I don't know. For me, it feels like I always work as a form of like resistance. And like maybe even like some of the work more directly are like based off like like women-led revolutions in Iran, or like, slogans of protests and things like that. And I think I don't know. I think I lost my train of thought, but I think the world building. I think that world building comes naturally to us all. I think because we're all kind of like we're not really accepting like a specific like untruth or something to our reality, and we're kind of working through it while within our works. And I
I
think
think
like both of you do.
storytelling, right? Like being
Yeah.
storytellers and kind of growing up by hearing stories and then wanting to create a process. I think a lot of, at least I think about the work as processing what we've been told or what we see or what we want to see in a way. Not to cut you off.
No, no, no. It cut me off. But Shama, I actually really was thinking about how like all of your figures are you. Like you are sort of like communicating with yourself, whether it's like the alter ego or the other you. And it's you're kind of like working through it like you're your own buddy in this sort of like world building. And you're creating these like almost like clones and getting together and like really working together and figuring out like what is going on.
Yeah. Yeah, they're like different aspects I feel like we all have, like you might like on a simplistic level you may stereotype someone or see them as a certain type, but in reality we all have all these different aspects that are battling each other. And I thought by painting I could kind of show the reality of that in a way that's kind of hard to see with your eyes, in the real world. I feel
Yeah.
like these symbols help, help make sense of the world.
Mm. Yeah, no, I would, the way that you represent yourself in these multiplicities, like sometimes you become the demonic force, or there's this, you're battling yourself or you're helping yourself. I just find that like being able to develop that kind of multiple, it's not a conventional sense of self-portrait, but it maybe is more accurate of how we are as humans.
Which I think also ties into the idea of performance, right? And we're performing in so many different contexts, in so many different ways. And I love that you're actually doing that and you're kind of thinking through and with yourself, um, and confronting that and allowing yourself to play and just create worlds. And yeah, I love that.
Oh, thank you, Isa. I mean, I like always was really impressed by how you could take something so serious, and with this history of violence, but like make fun of these characters that take themselves so seriously. I think it's like the perfect treatment. It's like the only thing you can do with a situation like that, I think, is to be able to see the human comedy.
I love that. That's so
Yeah,
smart. And I feel
yeah.
like I didn't get to talk about the kind of the idea of humor as well in the work. And I think it's kind of this lightheartedness, right, to talk about heavier subject matter. And I think it really started from those blind contour drawings where these distortions started to take place. And I've always been very interested in the idea of satire and caricature. I was actually home in Dubai recently and I found like caricatures that I had made from when I was like 10 years old. So I'm like, the line really go, talking about being a detective, like it was there, like the roots. So that was a big eureka moment. But using kind of satire, thinking about the kind of absurd movements, operating in a space of performance and staging, I think allows people to kind of connect and then just want to know more. Like, why are they kind of kicking like all the way up in the air? Or why are they 8 feet tall? Or, the mustaches. So I think going back to your idea of symbolism also becomes exciting and coding things. Yeah.
And I think like the red curtain really evokes the theatrical stage for me, and that's an experience where you are really entering into a medium that's shaping your experience of time. And so for me, like your work allows that, an entrance into an alternative time, into, you know, entering the time of the performance, but on your terms, which is through humor and unraveling rather than through the kind of rigid lines that the state imposes.
Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. Thank you to the artists. Um, I'm gonna hop back in to say a proper goodbye and also to make sure that we plug for everyone that Portals is on view until September 7th. So if you live in the DC area, if you are in the DC area and you haven't had a chance to see the show, you have until September 7th. So please come and see the work in person. It's a really beautiful exhibition. And we're so grateful to Donna for her working with us on the exhibition, and so grateful to all the artists. And hopefully we'll see some of you in person soon.